Lady Whistledown here, and tonight I bring you a tale so scandalous, so deliciously wicked in its deception, that even I, who have witnessed every manner of folly this season, find myself breathless with its audacity. They called it a tragedy when the Duke of Morven Heights lost his sight. Yet the true scandal began when a humble nurse walked through his doors and taught him to see the world and love anew. But can a heart once deceived ever trust again? Or will the light she brought become the very flame that burns them both? Ah, but before I unveil this tale of pride, deception, and redemption, subscribe, my dear listener, and whisper in the comments, from which corner of the world do you join me tonight? Now then, draw your curtains, pour your tea, and listen closely, for history is about to begin. Picture, if you will, the grand estate of Morven Heights, where just 3 weeks past, the most extraordinary charade began to unfold. Our protagonist? None other than Duke Terrence himself, that brooding pillar of masculine pride whose very presence once commanded every drawing room in London. You see, His Grace has suffered a most unfortunate accident during his morning ride. The physicians were summoned, grave pronouncements were made, and all of London's finest families rushed to express their deepest sympathies for his sudden affliction. Complete blindness, they whispered, perhaps permanent. I watched from my usual vantage point as carriage after carriage arrived at his estate, each bearing yet another concerned lady eager to demonstrate her charitable devotion. Lady Eliana was among the first. Naturally, that ambitious creature who has spent the better part of 2 seasons angling for a ducal coronet. How magnificently she swept into his drawing room, her silk skirts rustling with practiced grace, her voice pitched to that particular tone of breathy concern that she believes so becoming. "Your Grace," she proclaimed, settling herself artfully beside his chair. "I simply cannot bear to think of you suffering alone in such darkness. Please, allow me to remain and provide whatever comfort I might offer." But here is where our tale takes its most revealing turn. For when confronted with a duke who could no longer see their beauty, who required assistance with the most basic tasks, who had lost that commanding presence they so desperately craved, these devoted ladies found their charity remarkably short-lived. I observed Eliana's first attempt to guide him through his own gardens, the way she fumbled when he stumbled, how her voice grew sharp with impatience when he moved too slowly, the manner in which her eyes began to dart toward the carriage path as if calculating her escape. Within hours, she had manufactured some pressing engagement in town. "I shall return tomorrow, Your Grace," she promised, but we both knew, though only I would admit it, that tomorrow would bring nothing but excuses. One by one, they departed. The Countess claimed a sudden illness in her family. Lady Margaret discovered urgent estate matters requiring her immediate attention. Miss Charlotte remembered a prior engagement that simply could not be postponed. Each exit was performed with impeccable manners and flowery protests of regret, but exit they did nonetheless. Mitchell, the Duke's steadfast steward, watched this parade of abandonment with barely concealed disgust. I have long admired that man's loyalty, a rare commodity in our circles. When the last of the titled ladies had fled, he approached his master with characteristic directness. "Your Grace, we require someone with actual experience in such matters, someone who understands the care you truly need." But the Duke disagreed. He said he needed someone who could actually care for him, and not only to help treat his sight. And so it was that Mitchell was dispatched to seek for a lady who could care for the Duke properly, but at a ridiculous pay. For days, no one took the job, not even the lowest maidens around. But here, dear, lies the peculiar nature of fate's design. While Duke Terrence sits in his study, adjusting to his new reality with the dignity expected of his station, he knows not what manner of woman approaches his door. Tomorrow, a simple nurse will arrive, one who has spent her life caring for those society has forgotten. She will possess neither title nor fortune, neither beauty of face nor elegance of dress. She will come armed only with skill, determination, and a deep suspicion of men exactly like our Duke. How will such a woman respond to genuine suffering? How will her practical nature adapt to caring for a man stripped of his former power? I confess myself quite breathless with anticipation. When a nobleman accustomed to command meets a woman who acknowledges no authority save competence, what manner of lessons might both learn? When genuine affliction meets professional care, when vulnerability encounters strength, when a heart made proud by privilege discovers the humbling reality of dependence, what transformations might unfold? Tell me, when a man who once believed his worth lay in his power encounters a woman who values only character, what truths about love and worth might reveal themselves? When the foundations of one's world shift beneath tragedy's weight, who among us proves capable of building something beautiful from the ruins? The stage is set, the players are taking their positions, and I, your devoted chronicler of scandal and sentiment, shall be watching from the shadows as this most intriguing drama unfolds. For in my experience, it is often in our darkest hours that we discover lights we never knew we carried. Allow me to illuminate the shadows of our tale, my dear. For every story worth telling requires us to understand the wounds that shape such desperate hours. Duke Terrence was not always the man who now sits in darkness at Morven Heights. No, once upon a time, and how beginnings do mock us with their innocence, he was merely a young man, possessed of wealth, position, and that most dangerous of qualities, an open heart. I remember him during his first season, barely 21, and radiating that particular confidence that comes from never having been truly disappointed. Lady Catherine was her name, a vision in pale blue silk, with eyes like winter mornings and a smile that promised forever. How tenderly he courted her, how publicly he declared his devotion. The engagement announcement in the Times was positively poetic in its sentiment. But love, as I have observed time and again, makes fools of even the wisest men. While Terence composed sonnets and planned their future, Catherine was conducting a far more practical inventory. His annual income, his properties, his standing with the Prince Regent, all measured and found. Insufficient when compared to the aging but incredibly wealthy Lord Harrington's offer. The morning Terence discovered her in Harrington's arms, in his own conservatory no less, something vital died within him. Not merely love, though that certainly perished, but trust itself. From that moment forward, he began to see calculation where once he had seen affection, ambition where once he had found warmth. The subsequent years brought a parade of calculated courtships, each one reinforcing his growing cynicism. Lady Margaret, who inquired rather too frequently about his investments. Miss Charlotte, whose affections seemed directly proportional to his latest acquisition of property. The widow Sinclair, whose tender care lasted precisely until she learned of his cousin's stronger claim to the title should Terence die without issue. Each betrayal carved deeper lines around his eyes, hardened the generous mouth that had once laughed so freely. The Duke who now faces blindness with such stoic dignity is a man who has learned to expect the worst of everyone, and has rarely been proven wrong. But what of our heroine in this tale of affliction and healing? Ah, Karina. That name itself speaks of strength beneath simplicity. While Terence was learning to distrust love among silk cushions and crystal chandeliers, she was discovering its absence in far crueler circumstances. I have taken great care to uncover her history. And what a history it is. Born to a merchant family of modest means but great integrity, Karina knew the warmth of a household where affection was freely given and honestly earned. Her father built his small shipping business through hard work and fair dealing. Her mother tended their home with the kind of grace that comes from contentment rather than display. They were not wealthy, but they were happy. Until the night Lord Ashworth decided their small wharf would serve his expansion plans admirably. A few bribes to the right magistrates, some conveniently discovered irregularities in shipping documents, and suddenly the family that had never harmed a soul found themselves branded as smugglers. Karina was 17 when she watched her father's ships burn in the harbour, 18 when consumption claimed her mother, 19 when she buried her father, his heart broken as surely as if Lord Ashworth had driven a blade through it himself. From that devastation, she built herself anew. If society's gentlemen were capable of such casual cruelty, she would dedicate herself to healing the damage they wrought. She apprenticed herself to Karina, an ancient midwife who tended the poor districts where titled feet never tread. There, among the forgotten and the suffering, Karina learned that true nobility had nothing to do with birth and everything to do with character. Her hands grew skilled at binding wounds that society preferred to ignore. Her voice learned the particular gentleness required to comfort those whom the world had discarded. She developed an almost supernatural ability to see past pretense to the person beneath, a skill that made her invaluable to the sick, but dangerous indeed to those who lived behind masks. She comes to Morven Heights tomorrow, carrying more than simply medical supplies and clean linens. She brings with her a deep suspicion of privilege, a hard-won wisdom about the true nature of power, and most dangerous of all, a heart that, despite every reason for bitterness, still yearns to trust again. Mitchell's letter reached her through Karina, who knew her worth better than any titled lady's recommendation ever could. The position offered poor wages and temporary lodging, practical considerations that mattered far more to Karina than the social significance of caring for a duke. Another lord discovering the world doesn't revolve around his titles, she told Karina while packing her small bag. Well, sighted or blind, he'll receive the same care I give to every patient, competent, professional, and nothing more. Yet as she prepares to cross the threshold of Morven Heights, she carries questions that would surprise her if she examined them closely. What kind of man accepts such sudden affliction with dignity? How does a duke accustomed to command adapt to dependence? And most dangerously, what happens when professional distance meets genuine suffering? Tomorrow, when Karina enters his world of imposed darkness, she will encounter not the helpless, grateful invalid she expects, but a man whose tragedy may teach them both truths about strength, worth, and the dangerous territory where hearts dare to hope again. Two wounded souls, each convinced they understand the treacherous nature of their opposite sex, each armored against the very thing they most desperately need. What revelations await when such careful defenses meet such unexpected circumstances? The morning arrived grey and drizzling, as if the very heavens conspired to set the proper mood for our drama. I positioned myself strategically, one does have one's methods, to observe the arrival of our unsuspecting heroine at the gates of Morven Heights. Karina stepped from the modest hired coach with the practical grace of one accustomed to making her own way in the world. No maid accompanied her, no mountain of trunks proclaimed her importance. She carried a single worn leather bag and a basket of what I later learned contained her medical supplies. Her dress was simple brown wool, well mended and spotlessly clean, her dark hair pinned back with ruthless efficiency rather than fashionable artistry. Mitchell met her at the door. And I confess I felt a stirring of sympathy for the man. Here he stood, greeting a woman whose honest countenance spoke of someone who would expect nothing but truth from those around her. "Miss Karina," he said with careful formality, "His Grace awaits you in the study. I must warn you, his condition has left him rather withdrawn." How true those words were, though perhaps not in the way Mitchell intended. Karina merely nodded, her expression betraying nothing save professional interest. "I've cared for patients with similar afflictions before, Mr. Mitchell. Sudden blindness affects people differently. Some become angry, others despondent." "Has he shown any signs of accepting his condition?" "He's struggling with it, miss. The adjustment has been difficult." When Karina entered the study, I confess even I held my breath. Here was the moment when practical compassion would meet aristocratic suffering, when a woman suspicious of privilege would encounter genuine affliction. The Duke sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture carefully controlled despite his obvious discomfort. His eyes stared unseeing past her shoulder, the glazed quality of the truly blind unmistakable to one of her experience. "Your Grace," Karina said simply, offering no flowery condolences or breathless sympathy. "I'm Karina. I understand you require assistance adapting to your condition." Terrence turned toward her voice with the uncertain movements of one still learning to navigate by sound alone. "You may address me as Your Grace," he said stiffly, though his tone lacked its former commanding edge. "And yes, I require assistance, though I doubt someone of your background can truly comprehend what such a loss means to a man of my position." Even in affliction, he could not resist asserting his superiority, but if he expected Karina to be cowed by his hauteur, he had gravely miscalculated his opponent. "I comprehend loss quite well, Your Grace," she replied coolly, moving to open the heavy curtains he had kept drawn. "Perhaps more than you might imagine. Dwelling in darkness won't restore your sight, but it certainly won't help you adapt to its absence." Terrence's jaw tightened as unexpected sunlight flooded the room. "I prefer the curtains closed. The light serves no purpose when one cannot see it. The light serves the purpose of reminding you that the world continues beyond your affliction," Karina said matter-of-factly. "Now, shall we discuss your care, or would you prefer to spend the morning cataloguing my inadequacies?" Never had anyone spoken to him with such casual disregard for his rank. The ladies of his acquaintance either simpered or schemed, but none had ever treated him with such equality. Even in his current helpless state, her manner suggested she saw him as simply another patient requiring competent care. "I require assistance with basic tasks," he said through gritted teeth. "Reading, writing, navigation of the estate. Surely even someone of your humble origins can manage such simple duties." "I can indeed," Karina agreed, settling herself in a chair near his desk with proprietary calm. "Though I should mention, Your Grace, that in my experience, patients recover their independence more quickly when they abandon self-pity in favor of practical adaptation." The silence that followed was thunderous. I watched from my concealed vantage point as Terrence struggled between outrage at her impertinence and grudging respect for her directness. No one had dared speak to him so bluntly since his accident. Everyone had treated him with the careful deference reserved for the tragically afflicted. "You seem remarkably comfortable for someone meeting a duke for the first time," he observed, probing. "I've met men before, Your Grace. Some happen to inherit titles. Others earn respect through character. Your blindness doesn't change which category you belong to. It simply makes the distinction more obvious." She picked up a book from his desk. Wordsworth's poetry, I noted with interest. Shall I read to you, or would you prefer to continue this fascinating exploration of our respective social standings? For a moment, I thought he might dismiss her entirely. His hands clenched, his breath quickened, and something dangerous flickered across his features. But then, perhaps remembering his genuine need for assistance, he forced himself to relax. "Read," he commanded curtly, though his tone held less authority than he intended. What followed was perhaps the most peculiar reading session in the history of English literature. Karina's voice proved unexpectedly melodious as she recited Wordsworth's verses about nature and solitude, but her tone remained deliberately neutral, professional. She might have been reading a medical textbook for all the emotion she displayed. Terrence, meanwhile, found himself genuinely listening rather than brooding over his circumstances. Her voice held an undercurrent of strength that intrigued him despite his resentment. When she reached the lines about emotion recollected in tranquility, something in her tone suggested personal familiarity with such recollection. "You read well," he admitted grudgingly when she paused. "I read adequately," she corrected. "Shall I continue, or do you require assistance with something else?" The casualness with which she dismissed his praise that London's most accomplished ladies had once competed to receive, left him oddly off balance. She neither sought his approval nor seemed intimidated by his disapproval. She simply was present, competent, utterly self-possessed. As the afternoon wore on, I observed a most fascinating dynamic developing. Terrence's initial hostility began to transform into something approaching curiosity. When Karina guided him to the dining room for luncheon, her touch firm but impersonal, he found himself hyper-aware of her presence in a way that had nothing to do with his blindness. And Karina, despite her determined professionalism, began to notice things. The way he struggled to maintain his dignity while fumbling with unfamiliar darkness. The careful control he exercised over every movement, every expression, as if determined not to reveal the depth of his adjustment difficulties. "Tomorrow, we'll begin teaching you to navigate independently," she announced as she prepared to leave for the day. "You'll need to learn to trust your other senses if you're to regain any autonomy." "Trust," he repeated bitterly, an interesting choice of words. "It's a practical requirement, Your Grace. You must learn to trust your hearing, your touch, your spatial memory. Without trust, blindness becomes a prison rather than simply an inconvenience." As she gathered her things, Terrence found himself reluctant to see her go. Her presence had been unsettling, certainly, but also oddly refreshing. She treated his blindness as a problem to be solved rather than a tragedy to be mourned. "Miss Karina," he called as she reached the door, "will you return tomorrow?" "Unless you dismiss me, Your Grace. Healing takes time, but independence is achievable if you're willing to work for it." After her departure, I observed Terrence sitting alone in his study, fingers trailing absently across the book she had read from. For the first time since his accident, he seemed to be contemplating a future beyond his current darkness, not because his sight might return, but because someone had suggested his blindness need not define his limitations. Tell me, dear listener, when practical compassion meets genuine need, when stubborn independence encounters determined healing, what manner of transformation might unfold? For I suspect our tale has only just begun to reveal its true nature. Time, dear listener, has a peculiar way of eroding even the most carefully constructed barriers. What begins as professional duty gradually becomes personal investment. And investment, if we are not careful, transforms into something dangerously close to affection. 3 weeks. 21 days of intimate care that would test the resolve of both our players in ways neither had anticipated. Each morning began with the same ritual. Karina would arrive at his chamber door precisely at 7, her soft knock followed by that matter-of-fact voice announcing the weather, the day's planned activities, any correspondence that had arrived. She never lingered over pleasantries or fussed unnecessarily about his condition. She simply began. Terrence found himself anticipating that knock with an eagerness that surprised him. After years of women who spoke to him in honeyed tones calculated to charm, Karina's straightforward manner proved unexpectedly refreshing. When she asked if he had slept well, she wanted an honest answer, not an opportunity to offer sympathy. "Poorly," he replied one morning, abandoning his usual stoic responses. "The darkness feels different at night, more absolute." "That's normal," she said, and he could hear her moving about the room, arranging his clothing for the day with brisk efficiency. "Your mind is still adjusting to processing the world without visual confirmation. In time, you'll develop a different relationship with darkness. It will become familiar rather than frightening." It was perhaps the most honest conversation he had engaged in since his accident, and the words brought unexpected comfort. Karina spoke of his blindness not as a tragedy to be endured, but as an adaptation to be mastered. Their walks through the estate became exercises in patient education. Karina would describe the path ahead, warning of obstacles, teaching him to use sound and scent as guides. Her descriptions were vivid but practical, not romantic observations about beauty he could no longer appreciate, but useful details about navigation and safety. "There's a low branch ahead," she would say, her hand light on his arm. "Duck slightly. The path curves left here. Can you feel the change in the gravel beneath your feet?" And Terrence, who had walked these paths 1,000 times when sighted, began to discover his estate anew through senses he had never before relied upon. The different sounds gravel made compared to packed earth. The way air moved differently in open spaces versus tree-covered areas, the particular scents that marked different sections of the gardens. Rosina, the young parlour maid, often watched these daily expeditions from the kitchen windows. The girl had developed quite romantic notions about her master's tragic condition and his devoted nurse. She had no idea she was witnessing something far more complex than duty or pity. She was seeing the slow birth of mutual respect between two people who had expected nothing from each other save professional competence. The evenings proved most dangerous of all. Karina would read to him in the library, their chairs drawn close so he could follow along when she traced passages with her finger. Her voice would grow softer as the hour grew late. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would catch her pausing to observe him with what seemed like genuine concern rather than professional assessment. "You seem different from other gentlemen I've encountered," she said one night, closing a volume of Shakespeare they had been sharing. Terrence's pulse quickened. "Different how?" "More present, if that makes sense. Most men of your class seem perpetually distracted by their own importance. But you actually listen when I speak. You ask thoughtful questions. Your blindness hasn't diminished your intelligence. If anything, it seems to have sharpened your attention." The observation struck him like a physical blow. She was praising him for qualities that felt entirely natural in her presence, behaviors that emerged without conscious effort when she was near. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "adversity has taught me to value things I once took for granted." "Such as?" The question hung between them like a challenge. In the firelight, he could imagine her face, open, genuinely curious, free from the calculating expressions he had grown so weary of before his accident. such as conversation with an intelligent woman who expects nothing from me save honest engagement, such as discovering that one can know a person more truly through voice and manner than through appearance, such as learning that the most beautiful sound I know belongs to someone who cares nothing for my opinion of her beauty. The words escaped before he could recall them, honest and raw and completely inappropriate for their supposed relationship. The silence that followed felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Your Grace," she whispered, and he heard uncertainty in her voice for the first time since she had arrived. "Forgive me," he said quickly, turning his face away as if in shame. "This isolation has made me inappropriate in my expressions. Please disregard such foolishness." But the damage was done. The careful boundaries they had maintained for 3 weeks lay in ruins around them, and both were acutely aware of the change. When Karina guided him to his chamber that night, her touch lingered just a moment longer than necessary. When she bid him good night, her voice held a tremor that had nothing to do with professional concern. From my concealed observation post, I watched this slow-burning attraction unfold with the fascination of one witnessing a masterclass in human connection. Here was a man learning to see clearly for perhaps the first time in his life, and a woman discovering that her carefully guarded heart was not as impervious as she had believed. Each day brought new moments of impossible intimacy. The way she would unconsciously steady him when he stumbled, her touch lingering just a moment longer than strictly necessary. How he would turn his face toward her voice like a flower seeking sunlight, hanging on her every word with an attention that had nothing to do with his blindness. The charged silence when their hands accidentally touched while sharing a book or navigating a doorway. "You're healing well," she told him one afternoon as they sat in the garden, though she spoke of more than his physical adaptation. "Your confidence is returning. Soon you'll hardly need my assistance at all." The thought of her departure, which should have pleased him as a sign of recovery, instead filled him with something approaching panic. Over 3 weeks, she had become not just his guide through darkness, but his companion in discovering a different way of experiencing the world. "Will you stay?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before caution could intervene. "After I've achieved independence, will you consider remaining? Not as my nurse, but as my friend?" The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither dared examine too closely. Karina was quiet for so long that he feared he had overstepped irreparably. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been friends with a duke before, nor I with a woman who sees me so clearly despite my blindness," he replied. "Would you guard your honor, or follow your heart, gentle listener?" For our Karina faced precisely that choice as she watched her patient transform from a bitter, isolated man into someone of unexpected depth and growing warmth. And Terrence, poor soul, discovered that the heart he had thought safely armored against all feminine wiles had been completely conquered by the one woman who wanted nothing from him save the privilege of helping him heal. How exquisitely dangerous that the most genuine connection of his life should bloom in darkness, tended by hands that asked nothing of him but the courage to trust again. The 21st morning dawned with deceptive serenity, as if the very heavens conspired to mask the earthquake about to shatter our carefully constructed world. I had positioned myself with particular care that day, sensing through some intuitive gift that the delicate balance which had sustained itself for 3 precious weeks was about to reach its inevitable crisis. Karina arrived at the usual hour, but something in her manner had shifted overnight. Where once she had moved with brisk efficiency, now there was a tenderness in every gesture, a lingering quality to her attention that spoke of a heart no longer merely professional in its concern. She had fallen in love with her patient, dear listener, though she would have died before admitting such an impossible truth. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said softly, setting down her medical bag with unusual care. "How did you sleep?" Terrence, who had spent the night in restless contemplation of feelings he dared not name, turned toward her voice with the eager attention that had become his morning ritual. Her presence had become as essential to him as sunrise, though he experienced both now only through sound and warmth rather than sight. "Well enough," he replied, though his voice betrayed the sleepless hours. "I find myself troubled by thoughts I cannot quite organize." How could he tell her that he dreamed of her voice, that her footsteps had become music to his ears, that her gentle guidance had awakened something in him he had thought permanently buried beneath years of cynicism and disappointment? "Perhaps a walk would help clear your mind," Karina suggested, moving toward the windows. "The morning air might provide the clarity you're seeking." But as she reached to open the curtains, a daily ritual that had become as natural as breathing, her gaze fell upon something that made her blood freeze in her veins. There, scattered across his writing desk in careless abandon, lay correspondence clearly penned in his own hand. Fresh correspondence, written that very morning. The letters were not dictated responses laboriously transcribed by Mitchell or herself. These were documents composed and written by Terrence's own pen in his own flowing script, with the casual ease of one whose vision remained perfectly intact. Time seemed suspended as understanding crashed over her like a cold wave. Her eyes moved from the letters to his face, then back to the damning evidence. Her mind racing to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had believed for 3 devastating weeks. "Those letters?" she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're written in your hand." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched from my concealed vantage point as Terrence realized his fatal error, as the elaborate performance that had sustained him for 21 days crumbled in an instant before the evidence of his deception. "Karina," he began, his voice hoarse with something that might have been panic or relief or both. "You can see," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of devastating fact. "You can see perfectly well, and you've been able to see all along." In that moment, as if the truth of his deception had broken some invisible spell, Terrence abandoned the careful, unseeing stare he had maintained for weeks. His eyes, no longer glazed or unfocused, met hers with an intensity that took her breath away, eyes that were perfectly, brilliantly, cruelly clear. And then, as if compelled by forces beyond his control, he spoke the words that would shatter both their worlds, quietly. "You are meant for me." It should have been a moment of romantic triumph, this first clear sight of the woman who had captured his heart through voice and touch alone. She was indeed beautiful, but not in the polished manner of the society belles who had once commanded his attention. Her beauty lay in the strength of her features, the intelligence that sparkled in her dark eyes, the way her entire being radiated the competence and compassion that had drawn him like a moth to flame. But instead of wonder or joy, Karina's face reflected only horror and betrayal. The color drained from her cheeks as the full magnitude of his deception revealed itself with crystalline clarity. "You've been watching me," she whispered, her hands trembling as she backed toward the door. "All this time, you've been watching me, studying me, cataloguing my every response like some specimen in a laboratory of human behavior." "No," Terrence said desperately, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a man whose vision had never been impaired. It wasn't like that. I never intended. You never intended what? To make me care for you. To let me believe I was helping someone in genuine need. To allow me to develop feelings for a man who was playing an elaborate game of deception. Her voice rose with each word. Years of suppressed pain and fresh humiliation combining into something magnificent and terrible. Tell me, Your Grace, what was the true purpose of this charade? Were you testing my character? Amusing yourself with how thoroughly you could fool the simple country nurse? The accusation hit him like a physical blow, partly because it contained enough truth to wound, partly because it revealed how completely he had misjudged the effect his deception would have on her generous heart. I was testing them, he said desperately, knowing, even as he spoke, that the truth would only wound her further. The ladies who came before you, women of my own class who claimed devotion but fled when faced with genuine need. I wanted to know if any woman could love a man stripped of his power to dazzle, or provide, or protect. And I was your control experiment, Karina said, with bitter understanding, her voice cutting through his explanations like a blade through silk. The poor woman with nothing to gain from your title, nothing to lose from your supposed helplessness. How scientifically you planned it all. But then I fell in love with you, he said, the words torn from his throat with desperate honesty. God help me, Karina. I fell so deeply in love with you that I forgot it was ever meant to be a test. These past weeks, being with you, talking with you, discovering the world anew through your eyes, it became the most real, the most honest thing in my entire existence. For a moment, something flickered in her expression that might have been hope struggling against betrayal. But then her face hardened with the terrible finality of trust destroyed beyond repair. You looked at me all this time, she said, each word precise and devastating, delivered with the quiet fury of a woman who had dared to love and been made a fool for her courage. But you never saw me. With that pronouncement, that perfect encapsulation of his blindness to her worth, her dignity, her right to honesty, she turned and walked from the room, leaving Terrence standing in the wreckage of the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to him. Mitchell appeared in the doorway moments later, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and found his master staring at the empty space where love had stood just moments before. Your Grace? The faithful steward inquired carefully, though the scene before him told its own story. She's gone, Terrence said simply, and in those two words lay the collapse of every grand plan he had ever made, every cynical theory he had ever held about the nature of human affection, every wall he had built around his heart to protect it from exactly this kind of devastation. For in losing Karina, he had lost not just love, but the very man he had discovered himself to be in her presence. A man worthy of the devotion he had just thrown away through his own arrogance, fear, and catastrophic failure to trust in the very goodness he had set out to test. If this revelation has set your heart aflutter, do be kind, subscribe, and let us uncover the next secret together. The aftermath of revelation is always more devastating than the revelation itself. While passion may flare and die in moments, the slow burn of consequence consumes everything in its path with relentless, methodical thoroughness. Karina fled Morven Heights, as if the very stones might contaminate her with their deception. Her few possessions were packed within the hour, her departure so swift that even the servants barely glimpsed her tear-stained face as she climbed into the same modest hired coach that had brought her just 3 weeks prior. But where does a woman with a shattered heart and wounded pride retreat, when the world seems suddenly full of liars and manipulators masquerading as gentlemen? To Clarine's humble cottage in the village, naturally. That sanctuary where honest work and simple truths still held meaning in a universe gone mad with pretense. I confess I took particular care to observe her arrival at that modest dwelling. Claran, ancient and wise in the ways of human folly, took one look at her former apprentice's destroyed expression and asked no questions. She simply opened her arms and let Karina collapse against her shoulder with the desperate fury of one who has discovered that her carefully guarded heart has committed the ultimate betrayal. It has dared to love someone unworthy of that precious gift. I was such a fool, Karina sobbed, the words muffled against worn wool that smelled of herbs and comfort and everything honest her life had once contained. I thought his suffering had made him genuine, humble, real. But it was all performance, Clarine. Every word, every grateful glance, every moment I believed we were sharing something true. It was calculated manipulation designed to test my character like I was some sort of laboratory animal. "Tell me everything, child," the old woman said gently, guiding her to a chair by the fire that had always meant home and safety. And so the story poured forth. 3 weeks of growing intimacy built on lies, of professional duty transforming into unwilling love, of the devastating moment when blindness revealed itself as the cruelest kind of sight. As Karina spoke, I could see the deeper wound beneath her anger. Not just betrayal, but the terrible knowledge that she had allowed herself to trust again, only to have that trust weaponized against her very soul. "He studied me like a fascinating specimen," she whispered, her voice raw with humiliation that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Every kindness I showed, every moment I let my guard down, every time I spoke to him as if he were simply a man rather than a title. He was cataloguing it all, analyzing my responses, measuring my character against some predetermined scale of feminine virtue. Meanwhile, at Morven Heights, a different kind of devastation was unfolding with the slow inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Terrence had dismissed Mitchell's attempts at conversation and retreated to his study, where he sat staring at the chair Karina had occupied during their evening reading sessions. The book of Shakespeare lay open where she had left it, marking the page of Sonnet 116. "Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds." How those words mocked him now with their perfect irony. For what was his elaborate deception, if not proof that his capacity for love was built entirely on alteration, on the careful construction of false circumstances designed to test the very woman he had come to adore beyond reason? "Your Grace," Mitchell ventured carefully from the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern for the master he had served through triumph and disaster alike. "Perhaps if you were to go to her, explain your reasons, help her understand—" "Understand what?" Terrence asked with bitter self-knowledge that came too late to matter. "That my love was real, even though everything else was lies? That I wounded her deliberately in order to protect myself from being wounded? What explanation could possibly excuse what I've done to the one person who deserved nothing but honesty from me?" The days that followed were exercises in mutual torment, played out in the separate spheres their pride had created. Karina threw herself into caring for the village poor with desperate intensity, as if exhausting physical labor might somehow purge her heart of its treacherous feelings. She tended fevers and set broken bones and delivered babies with mechanical efficiency. But those who knew her best could see that some essential light had gone out of her. "She's punishing herself," Clarine confided to me during one of my carefully orchestrated encounters at the village market. "Believes she was weak for caring about him, foolish for thinking a duke could ever see her as anything more than an amusing diversion. She's built her walls twice as high as before, and I fear no man will ever breach them again." At Morven Heights, Terrence's suffering took a different but equally destructive form. He wandered the estate like a spectre, visiting every spot where they had walked together, touching every book she had read to him, torturing himself with memories of her voice, her laugh, the gentle way she had guided what she believed were his unseeing steps. Rosina, that romantic girl, tried once to speak of Karina's departure, suggesting with the innocent optimism of youth that perhaps the Duke might write to her, might attempt to make amends. The look he turned upon her was so desolate that she fled the room in tears, and word quickly spread among the staff that their master's name and the former nurse's were never to be mentioned in the same breath. "He's dying by degrees," Mitchell confided to me when I encountered him in the village one grey evening. "Won't eat properly, barely sleeps, just sits in that study staring at nothing. I've served his family for 30 years, and I've never seen a man destroy himself so thoroughly over a woman." "And what of her condition?" I inquired with delicate concern. "Same affliction, different symptoms entirely. She works herself to exhaustion during the day and cries herself to sleep at night. Clarine says she starts awake sometimes, calling his name, then remembers what he did and goes silent as stone for hours. Two hearts, broken by the same hand, his own. For in his arrogance and paralyzing fear of being deceived again, Terrence had created exactly the tragedy he had sought so desperately to avoid. He had found the one woman capable of loving him without artifice or calculation, and he had driven her away through the very machinations designed to protect himself from heartbreak. The cruelest irony, dear listener, was that his test had worked perfectly. Karina's love had proven itself genuine in every particular, constant through his supposed helplessness, uninterested in his wealth or position, focused entirely on the man she believed him to be, rather than the Duke she knew he was. She had passed his examination with colours so flying that they put his own character to shame, and her reward had been the devastating knowledge that the examiner himself was a fraud of the deepest dye. The Tun, naturally, buzzed with speculation about the Duke's mysterious recovery and his even more mysterious melancholy. Various theories circulated through drawing rooms and ballrooms, everything from unrequited love to financial difficulties to some dark family secret. But none suspected the truth, that Morven Heights had become the stage for the most exquisite love story of the season, and that both protagonists had been wounded beyond bearing by its resolution. As autumn approached with its promise of endings and transformations, I found myself wondering if pride and hurt could ever bend sufficiently to allow redemption. For while Terrence remained trapped in his tower of guilt and regret, and Karina buried her heart beneath layers of determined work and righteous anger, neither seemed capable of taking the first step toward the forgiveness that might heal them both. But fate has a way of forcing our hands when we prove too stubborn to act on our own behalf. And sometimes, the very blindness we create in jest becomes the vision we desperately require in earnest. 3 months of separate suffering had passed when fate decided to reveal its twisted sense of poetic justice. If Duke Terrence wished to play games with blindness to test the hearts of women, then perhaps the universe would teach him what true darkness meant, and whether the woman he had wronged possessed the forgiveness his deception had never earned. I was, naturally, among the first to learn of the accident. Mitchell sent word through his usual channels. My network of information is nothing if not comprehensive, and within hours I knew every devastating detail of that fateful morning ride. Terrence had taken to riding at dawn, pushing his stallion harder each day, as if physical exhaustion might somehow quiet the guilt that plagued his every waking hour. On this particular morning, fog lay thick across the estate, reducing visibility to mere yards. A sensible man would have postponed his ride, but sense had long since abandoned our tormented Duke. It was a rabbit, of all things, that sealed his fate with perfect irony. The small creature darted across the path, just as horse and rider approached the old stone bridge spanning the ravine. The stallion shied violently at the sudden movement. Terrence lost his seat entirely, and both tumbled down the rocky slope in a chaos of hooves and stone and sickening impact that echoed through the morning mist like judgment itself. Julian, the physician who had attended Terrence during his feigned blindness, found himself summoned again to Morven Heights, this time to tend injuries that were devastatingly, irreversibly real. The Duke lay unconscious for 2 days, his head wrapped in bloodied bandages, his breathing shallow and uncertain, while household and tenants alike held their breath in vigil. "Will he survive?" Mitchell asked, his weathered face grey with worry for the master he had served through every folly and triumph. "He'll live," Julian replied with grim certainty. "But the blow to his skull has severely damaged the optic nerves. When he wakes, I'm afraid he'll find himself in the very darkness he once pretended to inhabit." When consciousness finally returned to Terrence, it came with the cruel clarity of absolute, unrelieved blackness. No shadows, no gradations of light, no hope of sight returning, only the endless night he had so convincingly performed just months before, now his permanent reality. The irony was not lost on him as he lay in his bed, exploring the boundaries of his new condition with trembling fingers. He had feigned blindness to test love, and lost the only love worth having. Now, truly sightless, he faced a future without even the memory of Karina's face to comfort him in his deserved darkness. "Send for her," he whispered to Mitchell on his 3rd day of consciousness, his voice hoarse from the medications Julian had administered. "Your Grace, perhaps a physician from London?" "Not a physician. Send for Karina." Mitchell's silence spoke volumes about the impossibility of that request. The woman his master had deceived so cruelly would hardly rush to his aid now that his need was genuine rather than manufactured. "Sir, after what transpired between you, she may not come. She may not even respond to such a request." "Then we must give her a reason that has nothing to do with my desires and everything to do with medical necessity," Terrence said, with the desperate calculation of a man who had lost everything and found himself willing to risk even his remaining pride. "Tell her the truth, that I am truly blind now, that I require skilled care from someone experienced with such conditions, and that no other nurse in the county possesses her particular expertise. And if she refuses regardless? Then I will deserve the darkness I find myself in, and she will have her revenge complete." The letter Mitchell carried to Clarine's cottage was perhaps the most carefully worded document ever composed by a duke's steward. It spoke of medical necessity rather than personal appeal, of professional opportunity rather than romantic reconciliation. It mentioned compensation generous enough to make refusal economically unwise, but offered no hint of the emotional devastation that had prompted its composition. Karina read it 3 times before speaking, her face revealing nothing of the storm raging within her breast. 3 months of determined forgetting, of building walls around her wounded heart, of convincing herself that what she had felt for the Duke was mere illusion, born of proximity and pity. All of it crumbled at the sight of his name written in Mitchell's careful script. "He's truly blind this time?" she asked Clarine, who had been watching her former apprentice with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom about the wayward paths of human hearts. "So, Dr. Julian confirms. The injuries are severe, the damage permanent. There will be no miraculous recovery from this condition." "And he specifically requested my attendance?" "The letter suggests you're the most qualified nurse available for such specialized care." But both women knew that qualification was hardly the only consideration weighing upon such a request. Karina stared out the cottage window toward the distant towers of Morven Heights, her heart warring between compassion and self-preservation with all the ferocity of a battle for her very soul. "I cannot," she whispered finally, the words torn from her throat. "I cannot return to that place, tend to that man, pretend that what happened between us can be forgotten simply because his circumstances have changed. It would destroy what little peace I've managed to build from the ruins he made of my trust." The old woman nodded with the understanding of one who had seen many hearts broken and mended over her long lifetime. "Perhaps destruction is what's needed, child. Sometimes we must be broken completely before we can be rebuilt properly. You think I should go to him?" "I think," Clarine said carefully, "that love denied becomes love distorted. You've spent 3 months trying to hate him for his deception, but hatred requires as much passion as love itself. Perhaps it's time to discover which emotion truly rules your heart." That night, Karina lay awake, wrestling with impossible choices that seemed designed to torture her regardless of what she decided. Professional duty demanded she answer the call. Her skills were indeed superior to any available alternative, and a patient's genuine need should supersede personal grievances. But emotional survival suggested flight, the preservation of the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed from the debris of her trust. When morning came, she made her decision with the quiet courage that had always defined her character, even when that character had been tested beyond reasonable endurance. "I'll go," she told Clarine simply, "but only as his nurse. Nothing more than professional care for a man who requires it." "Of course, child," Clarine agreed, though her eyes held knowledge that her former apprentice was not yet ready to acknowledge. As Karina packed her medical supplies for the second time that year, neither she nor Terrence knew what awaited them in the days ahead. He lay in genuine darkness, hoping against hope that the woman he had wronged might find it in her heart to care for his suffering. She prepared to return to the scene of her greatest humiliation, armed only with professional duty and a determination to keep her heart safely locked away from any possibility of further damage. But fate, dear listener, rarely grants us the tidy resolutions we plan for ourselves. The second arrival of Karina at Morven Heights could not have been more different from her first. Where once she had stepped from a humble coach with professional briskness, now she emerged from Clarine's cart with the careful composure of a woman girding herself for the battle of her lifetime. Mitchell met her at the door with relief so profound it bordered on the comical. The poor man had spent days watching his master sink deeper into genuine despair, refusing proper nourishment, barely speaking, existing in a twilight world that had nothing to do with his physical blindness and everything to do with his spiritual desolation. "Miss Karina," he said, his voice thick with gratitude and hope in equal measure. "Thank you for coming. His condition has been most challenging to manage." "I'm here as a nurse," she replied firmly, though I detected the slightest tremor in her voice, the only sign that returning to this place of memory and heartbreak cost her more than professional composure could entirely conceal. "Nothing more? Is Dr. Julian still attending him regularly?" "He comes daily, but confesses himself somewhat at a loss. The Duke refuses most treatment, shows little interest in adapting to his new circumstances. Perhaps your particular experience might succeed, where our efforts have failed." As they climbed the familiar stairs to the master's chamber, Karina found herself remembering another time, another arrival, when she had believed herself to be caring for a blind man who was merely performing helplessness with theatrical precision. Now, the helplessness was devastatingly, irreversibly real, and she was the one performing, pretending that her heart wasn't racing, that her hands weren't trembling, that seeing him again wouldn't tear open wounds she had spent months trying to heal. The sight that greeted her in his chamber nearly shattered her carefully maintained professional façade. Terrence sat by the window, his face turned toward light he would never see again, his once proud shoulders slumped in defeat that was no longer calculated or temporary. The bandages had been removed, revealing eyes that stared sightlessly ahead with the particular emptiness of genuine blindness, and the hollows in his cheeks spoke of weeks without adequate nourishment or care. "Your Grace," she said quietly, setting down her medical bag with hands that barely betrayed their trembling. "I've come to assess your condition and provide whatever professional care you require." He turned toward her voice with an eagerness that he tried desperately to suppress, but she caught it nonetheless. That moment of desperate, pathetic hope before his features settled into resigned acceptance of whatever judgment she might render upon him. "Miss Karina," he said, and her name on his lips held a weight of meaning that threatened to completely destroy her professional equilibrium. "I wasn't certain you would come. I had no right to expect such mercy from you." "A patient's medical needs supersede personal considerations," she replied with cool professionalism, moving to examine him with the practiced efficiency that had always been her shield against the world's cruelties. But as her fingers gently probed the healed wounds on his skull, she found herself remembering another time when she had touched him so, when his blindness had been elaborate pretense, and her care genuinely offered to someone she believed truly needed it. "The injuries appear to be healing as well as can be expected," she announced, stepping back quickly before her touch could linger longer than medical necessity demanded. "Are you experiencing persistent headaches? Dizziness? Any residual pain from the trauma?" "Only the pain I have earned through my own actions," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her examine him more closely, despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. This was not the arrogant Duke who had orchestrated such elaborate deceptions for his own amusement. This was a broken man who had learned the true cost of his pride and found the price higher than he could bear to pay. "Self-pity serves no medical purpose," she said briskly, though her heart clenched painfully at the genuine desolation in his voice. "If you wish to regain any degree of independent functionality, you'll need to begin adapting to your condition immediately. Can you dress yourself adequately? Navigate familiar rooms without assistance? Maintain proper nutrition?" "I can do nothing adequately anymore," he admitted with bitter, complete honesty. "I sit here in the darkness I deserve, waiting for whatever ending fate has planned for me, since life itself seems to have lost all meaning or purpose." The words struck her like physical blows, each one a reminder that this was not the performance of a man seeking sympathy or manipulation, but the genuine confession of someone who had abandoned all hope entirely. Despite every reason to hate him, despite every wall she had built around her wounded heart, Karina found herself profoundly moved by his utter dejection. "That's quite enough of such talk," she said sharply, reverting to the no-nonsense tone that had once penetrated his manufactured helplessness so effectively. "You're alive, Your Grace, and while you remain among the living, you have responsibilities. To your estate, to your tenants, to the people who depend upon your leadership. What responsibilities can a truly blind man possibly fulfill? The same ones you fulfilled quite capably when you were merely pretending to be blind," she said. And the words hung in the air like a deliberate challenge. "Or have you somehow forgotten how well you managed your affairs during those 3 weeks of elaborate performance?" For the first time since her arrival, something flickered in his sightless eyes that might have been the ghost of hope struggling against despair. "You remember those days?" "I remember everything about them," she said quietly, and in those words lay 3 months of careful remembering, of treasuring moments she knew to be false. of loving a man she had believed to be someone entirely different from who he really was. Then you know that I am a fraud in all things that matter. That performance you witnessed, it was the closest I have come to honesty in my entire adult existence. Honest. The word escaped sharper than she had intended, carrying with it the full weight of her accumulated hurt and betrayal. You call deliberate deception about your condition honest? I call feeling something genuine for the first time in years honest, he said with sudden, desperate fierceness. I call falling so completely in love that I forgot my own elaborate charade honest. I call discovering that the woman I thought I was testing had already surpassed every test simply by being herself. That was the only truth in my entire miserable, calculating existence. The confession hit her like a storm, breaking over carefully constructed seawalls, sweeping away her maintained professional distance in a torrent of remembered emotion. She had prepared herself for his neediness, his guilt, even potential attempts at manipulation. But not for this raw admission of love that made her 3 months of determined forgetting seem like the greatest self-deception of all. You tested my heart like it was some sort of scientific experiment, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own pulse thundering in her ears. You made me fall in love with a man who was nothing but an elaborate performance. But that man was real, he said desperately, rising from his chair with the uncertain movements of one still learning to navigate genuine blindness, turning toward her voice with uncanny accuracy born of desperate need. In those moments with you, reading together in the library, walking through the gardens, talking about books and dreams and everything that makes life worth living, that man was more real than I had ever been before, or have been since. That man was built on fundamental lies. Then let me rebuild him on absolute truth. He moved closer, his hands outstretched, seeking her in the darkness that had become his permanent companion. Let me prove that what we shared transcended the false circumstances that created it. She stood frozen as his fingers found her face with the reverent desperation of a blind man, mapping the features of salvation itself, tracing the contours he had stolen glances of during their time together, but never been permitted to study openly. You're even more beautiful than I dared imagine, he whispered. And I imagined you constantly during those weeks when I was too much a coward to look at you directly, too afraid that my eyes would betray the truth of what I was feeling. Terrence? She breathed, his name escaping before she could prevent it, carrying with it the accumulated weight of love and hurt and hope she had tried so desperately to bury. I love you, he said, with the simple honesty of a man who had lost everything save the capacity for truth. I loved you when I could see and was too proud and frightened to admit it. And I love you now in this darkness, with nothing left but the honesty I should have shown you from the beginning. If you can find any forgiveness in your heart, any possibility that what we built together was worth preserving despite the lies that created it, then please, please don't abandon me to this darkness alone. The tears she had held back for months finally came, streaming down her cheeks as years of careful emotional control crumbled beneath the weight of his complete vulnerability and desperate honesty. This was the man she had fallen in love with during those 3 precious weeks. Vulnerable, capable of growth, able to see past his own privilege, to recognize genuine worth in others. The deception that had revealed him might have been cruel, but the transformation it had wrought was utterly, devastatingly real. I never stopped loving you, she whispered, the admission torn from her very soul. I tried to hate you, tried to forget you, tried to convince myself that what we shared was illusion, but every patient I tended, every hand I held, every word of comfort I offered, It was all shadowed by the memory of what we had discovered together. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate gratitude of a man reprieved from a death sentence he had pronounced upon himself, and she kissed him back with the fierce joy of a woman who had finally come home to the only place her heart had ever truly belonged. They were both broken people who had wounded each other terribly through pride and fear and the terrible vulnerability that love demands. But in that moment, they began the slow, patient work of healing. Not just his sight, which would never return, but their hearts, which had always seen each other clearly when courage allowed truth to flourish. "Can you forgive me?" he asked against her lips. "Can you forgive me for ever doubting that what we shared was the most real thing either of us had ever experienced?" They held each other in the afternoon light, streaming through windows he could no longer appreciate, but she could see clearly, and I confess myself quite overcome by the sheer beauty of their reunion. For this, dear listener, was love in its truest, most tested form, not the passion of first meeting or the comfort of familiar companionship, but the fierce, hard-won tenderness of two souls who had found each other again across an ocean of mistakes and pride and pain, and chosen forgiveness over the safer harbour of accumulated hurt. 6 months later, on a morning when spring had painted the gardens of Morven Heights in every conceivable shade of hope and renewal, I found myself positioned to observe what was surely the most unlikely wedding ceremony London society had witnessed in decades. The Duke stood at the altar of the village church, not the grand cathedral where his ancestors had pledged their troths in ceremonies of state, but the humble stone building where common folk had been exchanging vows for centuries. His choice of venue had caused considerable consternation among members of the ton, but those who understood the full story recognized its perfect appropriateness. Beside him stood Mitchell, serving as his eyes and guide, though Terrence had learned to navigate his world with remarkable skill in the months since accepting his condition. The period of genuine blindness had taught him what his pretended affliction never could. That true strength came not from sight, but from the courage to trust, and that the clearest vision was that which came from an honest heart. Karina approached down the aisle on Clarence's arm, her dress simple white cotton rather than elaborate silk and pearls, her veil a length of ancient lace that had belonged to her beloved mother. She carried wildflowers from the estate gardens, roses and lavender and sweet William, arranged by her own capable hands rather than any fashionable London florist. But oh, dear listener, how radiant she appeared in her chosen simplicity. There was a luminous quality about her that had nothing whatsoever to do with expensive finery, and everything to do with pure, uncomplicated joy. This was a woman who had fought her way back to love through the wilderness of betrayal and forgiveness, and won the greatest victory of all, the triumph of grace over accumulated hurt. As the vicar began the ancient words that had bound countless couples before them, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect peace. A deception meant to expose shallow hearts had revealed the truest love imaginable. A man who had tested sincerity had discovered that his own heart was the one requiring the most rigorous examination. A woman who had sworn never to trust nobility again had found that genuine nobility had nothing to do with inherited titles and everything to do with earned character. "Do you, Terrence, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the vicar asked, his voice carrying across the small church filled with tenants and servants who had watched this love story unfold. "I do," he replied, his voice resonating with absolute certainty that reached every corner of the sacred space. "I take her not merely as my wife, but as my conscience, my courage, my sight in all the things that truly matter in this life." "And do you, Karina, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she said, with firm conviction that brooked no doubt. I take him not as a duke, but as the man who learned to see most clearly only when he could no longer see at all. When they kissed to seal their sacred vows, there was not a dry eye remaining in that little church. Even I, who have witnessed every conceivable form of human folly and redemption, found myself quite overcome by the sheer beauty of their love story's resolution. The wedding breakfast was held in the estate's servants' hall rather than the grand dining room, with every tenant and worker invited to share in their happiness. Rosina, that incurably romantic girl, had decorated the space with such enthusiastic joy that it rivaled any London ballroom for sheer celebratory atmosphere. Julian offered the first toast, raising his glass with the deep satisfaction of a physician who had witnessed the most complete healing of his long career. To the Duke and Duchess, he proclaimed, who have proven beyond doubt that love is indeed the finest medicine available to humanity, and that the heart sees truest when unencumbered by the blindness of pride. To second chances, added Mitchell, his weathered face bright with joy for the master he had served faithfully through darkness and light alike. To the courage of forgiveness, whispered Clarraine, dabbing at her eyes with a worn handkerchief that had witnessed many such moments of joy. But it was Karina herself who offered what I considered the most perfect toast of all. Rising from her chair with her husband's hand clasped firmly in hers, she looked around at the assembled company with eyes bright with tears of pure, uncomplicated happiness. To my husband, she said with simple eloquence, who taught me that the greatest courage lies not in avoiding deception, but in choosing absolute truth even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. And to all of us who have learned that love, when it comes without pride or pretense or conditions, can heal even the deepest wounds that life inflicts upon the human heart. As the celebration continued well into the evening, I observed the small details that spoke of their profound contentment. The way Terrence would instinctively turn his face toward Karina's voice like a flower seeking sunlight. How she would guide his hand to his wineglass, or describe the faces of their guests with such vivid precision that he could see them perfectly through her loving words. The unconscious tenderness with which they moved around each other, each anticipating the other's needs with the graceful choreography that only comes from true partnership. Later, as the guests departed and the newlyweds retired to their chambers for their first night as husband and wife, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that love had accomplished. The proud, cynical Duke, who had once treated hearts as commodities to be tested, had become a man of genuine humility and hard-won wisdom. The guarded, wounded nurse, who had sworn never to trust again, had discovered that the greatest risks could yield the most precious rewards. Their love story would indeed become legend in the county, the tale of the Duke who pretended to be blind and learned to see, the nurse who cared for his darkness and brought him into the light of genuine love. But I knew the deeper truth. Theirs was not merely a story of deception redeemed, but of two wounded souls who had found the courage to heal each other through the alchemy of honest, patient, forgiving love. As I pen these final words by candlelight in my own study, I can see the windows of Morven Heights glowing warmly in the distance like beacons of hope. Behind those welcoming windows, two people who have suffered and learned and forgiven are beginning their life together, not as duke and commoner, not as patient and nurse, but as husband and wife who have earned their happiness through the most demanding test of all, the willingness to love without reservation, despite every reason for caution that experience had taught them. And so, dear listener, we reach the conclusion of our tale. The tongue may whisper of scandal and wonder at a duke who married so far beneath his supposed station, But those whispers matter less than nothing to hearts that have found their perfect complement. For in the end, the greatest nobility is not inherited but consciously chosen, and the truest sight comes not from eyes that perceive the world's surface, but from souls brave enough to look deeply into each other and call what they find their home. Do you believe redemption can rewrite every sin of pride? I confess myself utterly convinced that it can. When love provides the pen, forgiveness supplies the parchment, and truth guides the steady hand that inscribes the final story. Until we meet again in the shadows of London's glittering ballrooms and whispered drawing rooms, I remain your devoted chronicler of hearts, brave enough to love against all odds and wise enough to choose grace over grievance. And if this tale of love found in darkness has stolen your breath, subscribe, like, and share, for more scandals of the heart await.